There, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to reading Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws. Today, we're looking at Book 22, which is the third book within part 4 of the Spirit of the Laws, which deals with commerce. These are the commerce chapters. These are the books, sorry, commerce chapters, the books that address commerce. Today's topic is on the relation on laws and their relation to the use of money. So money, the question of money, right? Chapter 1, the reason for the use of money. People who have little in way of commodities for commerce, such as savages, and people with a police who only have uh, 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 two or three kinds of commodities, right? Trade by exchange. So therefore, this is people with police who have a very limited commodities. By police, it means morals, certain kind of morals, uh, codes of morals, social mores, social things. The term police is not understood not in terms of law enforcement, but rather moral enforcement. Okay, a police is somebody who looks at the question of people's habits and customs and mores, right? And looking at this in terms of that. So therefore, he says savages with very little commodities, or people with heavy police, up with the police, with only two or three kinds of commodities, they trade by exchange simply. Thus, the Moorish caravans that go to Timbuktu in the heart of Africa to barter salt for gold needs no money. Okay, a Moor puts his salt in a pile, the Negro his gold dust in another, and if there's not enough gold, the Moor takes back some of the salt, or so the Negro adds to his gold until the parties agree. Okay, this is the idea of trade exchange, right? But when people deal with a large number of commodities, there must necessarily be money, because the metal that is easy to transport saves much of the cost one would be obliged to incur if one always proceeded by exchange. Therefore, this is making things more efficient. Money makes things more efficient. Now, the coinage, the coins, right? Money is the coins, gold coin, silver, copper. As all nations have reciprocal needs, it often happens that one of them wants a very large number of the other's commodities, and the latter, very few of the formers. Whereas, with regard to another nation, the situation is reversed. So he's saying that I want all of your stuff, but you don't really want none of my stuff. Okay, but there's another nation that wants a lot of my stuff but doesn't want any of your stuff. Okay, this creates the situation, right? But when the nations have money and proceed by sale and purchase, the ones that take more commodities settle their accounts or pay the excesses with silver. And there is a difference that in the case of the purchase, commerce is done in proportion to the needs of the nation that requires the most, and in exchange, commerce is done only to the extent of the needs of the nation that requires the least. Okay, so in other words, the proportion of the needs of a nation that requires the most. In exchange, pure exchange, commerce is done by the. So therefore, when it's done by money, right? Commerce is done because of purchase and money. Um, there's a difference in that in the case of purchase, buying things with money, right? Commerce is done proportion to the needs of the nation that has the most wants. But if it's done in exchange, pure exchange of goods and goods, right? Then it's done to the extent of the needs of the nation that wants the least. If this were not so, the latter would find it impossible to settle its accounts, right? In that sense, settles accounts. So number 2, chapter 2, on the nature of money. Money is a sign representing the values of all commodities. Some metal is chosen so that the sign will be durable. In other words, durability, right? But now we have paper, we have things that are virtuous things, right? Will be little worn by use, and can be divided many times without being destroyed. A precious metal is chosen so that the sign can be carried easily. A metal is altogether an appropriate common measure because it can be easily reduced to the same grade. Each state stamps it so that the form reflects the grade and weight, and so that both can be known simply by looking at it. Again, this is it's stamped and made so that you know what its value, know its weight, and know its value, its aspect, what value it is. Before using metals, the Athenians used oxen and the Romans sheep. But one ox is not the same as another. In the same way, one piece of metal can be the same as another. So therefore, the animals are not the same. In other words, allows for similarity, identity, same thing. Oxes and sheep will vary to some degree. As silver is a sign of the values of commodities, paper is a sign of the value of silver. Okay, and when paper is good, it represents silver so well that there is no difference in its effect. Therefore, this is even better that if it's regulated. In other words, if its paper is good, the good paper is good quality, good, and it's right. Also, good means that it's being done honestly, correctly, and from this, that there's no difference between it represents silver, and there's no difference between it in terms of effect. Just as silver is a sign of a thing and represents it, each thing is a sign of silver and represents it. And a state uh, uh, and a state is prosperous, not preposterous, prosperous. Right, that means well off. Right, insofar, on the one hand, the silver indeed represents all things, and on the other, all things indeed represent silver, and they are signs of one another. That is, the relative value is such that one can have the first as soon as one has the latter. So, in other words, he's saying that the silver is merely is the representative of the goods and assets and things that are to be sold. That silver itself has no real really has no value of itself. It's a medium for exchange. Its value here. Now, earlier book we talked about the danger of gold and silver being too much, because this is kind of like inflation, like printing too much money, right? This is what the same point is, that it is a medium for exchange. This happens only in a moderate government. So, in other words, this relative capacity, the connection that silver has, that silver represents the assets and values of the things that a city has. But this happens in a moderate government. But it does not always happen in a moderate government. Okay, so it happens only in a moderate government, but it does not always happen in a moderate government. For example, if the laws favor an unjust debtor, the things belonging to him do not represent silver and are not assigned for it. In other words, so therefore, okay. So if the laws favor an unjust debtor, the things belonging to him do not represent silver. With regards to a despotic government, it would be a marvel if things were represented, if things there represented their sign. Tyranny and distrust makes everyone bury his silver. Therefore, things there do not represent silver at all. So tyranny and despotism, people hide their silver in that sense. They hide these things. It does not. It's very difficult to say things represent things. Okay? Legislatures have sometimes used such art that things have not only represented silver by their nature, but they have become money like silver itself. Caesar, a dictator, permitted debtors to give land in payments to their creditors at the price they fetched before the Civil War. Tiberius ordered that those who wanted silver could have it from the public treasury by pledging lands worth double the amount. Under Caesar, lands were the money that paid all debts. Under Tiberius, 10,000 sesterces of land became the money in common use, like 5,000 sesterces of silver. So therefore, this idea of people could pay land. This was designed to help the poor, to help those the people who lost everything because of the war and the rise of the new plantations and more economic system. So the land became valueless. But what Caesar did was what Caesar and Tiberius, what they did was they set the prices of land high, so the people who had land but not profit from it. The value of the actual land on the market was like this. So therefore, setting the tone of the value of land higher, thus making um, in England, the Magna Carta prohibited seizing the lands or the income of a debtor when his movable or personal goods are sufficient for the payment and when he offers to give them. Henceforth, all the goods of Englishmen represented silver. So therefore, the lands you cannot touch. You cannot touch that, but they're movables. The movables, that's their silver. The German laws gave an appeal in silver for the satisfaction of wrongs one had committed and penalties for crimes, right? So therefore, silver could be the satisfaction of this. But as there were very little silver in the country, the laws reappraised the silver in produce and livestock. So converted livestock and produce as to silver. This occurs in the laws of the Saxons, which with certain differences for the various peoples according to their case and comfort. So therefore, at first, the laws declared the value of a sou in livestock. The sou of two trimeces corresponded to an ox of 12 months or a sheep with his lambs. That of three trimeces was worth an ox of 16 months. Among these people, money became livestock commodities or produce, and these things became silver. Not only is silver a sign of a thing, it is also the sign of silver and represents silver, as we shall see in the chapter on exchange, right? So, in the chapter on exchange. So, therefore, silver not only is, in other words, silver is a sign of things, it is also a sign of silver. Things are, okay, and represents silver. Chapter 3, money, on ideal monies. Ideal monies. There are real monies and ideal monies. So, real monies and ideal monies. People with police, almost all of whom use ideal monies, do so only because they have converted their real monies into ideal ones. So, what is ideal ones? Ideal ones are kind of like, so this is ideal monies, maybe imagined in the mind of at the level of an idea, right? Or some kind of fixed thing, right? At first, their real monies have a certain weight and a certain grade of metal, but soon bad faith made or need made them withdraw parts of the metal from each piece of money, leaving it with the same weight, same name. Inflation. They kept playing more games. This is Grisham's law, right? Or Paul's called Copernicus law, right? Grisham's law. Money chases out good, right? For example, a coin weighing a livre. One take away half of the silver, and it is still called a livre. That coin has that coin that was a 20th part of a livre of silver is still called a sou, although it no longer no longer it is no longer the 20th part of that livre. Right? This is the whole discussion. Here livre or a pound was measured of weight as well as a unit of currency. The livre, a pound, right? So the livre as an ideal livre, and the sou as an ideal sou, and the same for the other subdivisions. And this can reach a point at which what is called a livre will be no more than a very small portion of a livre, which renders it still more ideal. It can even happen that a coin uh, 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 worth precisely a livre or a coin worth a sou is no longer made. So the livre and the sou will be purely ideal monies, this notional. One that will give to each coin the denomination as of many livres and as many sous as one likes. The variation can be continual because it is easy to give another name to a thing as it is difficult to change the thing itself. So, in other words, notional money. This is like notional that we say, okay, that we just say we just say it. Maybe that's fiat money. Maybe that's another word, fiat money. We can say that this is the money that we just, you know, but that's real. Fiat seems to suggest real. Okay. And fiat, something is fiat, something is given. Okay, no, but no, something is given. Something is given. This is ideal. Okay. This is this, that sense, right? Fiat is something that we assert to be so, right? Well, this is the similar thing. The ideal thing seems to be something it's notional in that sense. I can continue, in other words, in order to remove the source of abuses is very good. And in every country where one wants commerce to flourish, that you want to be cheating, right? For there to be a law that orders one to use real monies and to perform no operation that might render them ideal, like nominal, um, so therefore, the real money, something that's real money, is the real value of the thing it is, where ideal money is notional. That this is saying like this and like this, and this is usually a sign of bad government, or no, let's say not bad government, yeah, but there's a police. No, he says that with the police. I want to get that correct. A people with the police, almost all of whom use ideal monies, do so only because they have converted. In other words, they needed to have ideal monies because they've ruined their coinage in that sense. They have so ruined their coinage and ruined their things. They need some regulation on these things. But it's preferable that good commerce in the country one wants to flourish, it has to have good money. It is very good in every country where one wants commerce to flourish for there to be a law that orders one to use real monies and perform no operation that could render them, this problem, ideal, nominal, right? Nothing should be as exempt from variation as that which is the common measure of everything. So therefore, if this is going to be the common measure for everything, the coin, then this has to be not variation. If it's in variation, then that's kind of problematic, right? Nothing should be as exempt from variation as, and actually that's even good for in science too. The idea, if we're going to be the common measure of things, the thing we're using to measure cannot be something at variance. We need something that the measurement mechanism must be as exempt from variation as possible. And this is what he's saying here about this, that the means of exchange, that this needs to be not so chaotically at variance, so that makes it difficult, makes exchange difficult. We want to make exchange as easy as possible. Trade itself is very uncertain, right? This is right. And it's a great ill to add new uncertainties to the ones founded on the nature of the thing. So therefore, that's why messing around money and making uncertain the means of exchange uncertain makes commerce uncertain. Commerce is already kind of uncertain. There is a kind of uncertainty here. And therefore, what happens here is that to add another level of uncertainties make things even more difficult than it is when the nature of a thing is, he's saying. Chapter 4 on the quantity of gold and silver. When nations with the police are masters of the world, the quantities of gold and silver increase every day because the nations either mine them or go home or go abroad to find them where they are. On the other hand, they diminished when barbarian nations gained the advantage. Because the barbarians want to hide it. One knows how scarce those metals were when the Goths and the Vandals, from one side, and the Saracens and the Tartars on the other had invaded everywhere. So therefore, they became movable. They became things. So there's a police and morals, and there's increase. There's going to be increase in gold and silver. When there is when barbarians are about, there's a massive decrease. Chapter 5, continuation, same subject. The silver mine in America, transported Europe and sent there to the east, has favored European navigation. And it is an additional commodity that Europe receives in barter with America, and that it sends to the Indies for barter. Therefore, a greater quantity of gold and silver is favorable when one considers these metals as commodities. Um, it is not favorable when one regards them as a sign, because their abundance runs counter to the status of a sign, which is founded largely on scarcity. So, therefore, before the First Punic War, the proportion of a copper to silver was 960 to 1. Today, it's 73.5 to 1. Okay, this is what? 7 is from Tacitus, and this is from the leagues of the Saxon laws, right? It's if it's okay, okay. If the proportion were as it was formerly, silver would all the better still fulfill its function as a sign. In other words, that the amount of silver in the world increases the inflation. In other words, the value has become less, right? So therefore, it was one piece. In other words, one silver to 900 something copper. Now it's 70. It's dramatic. So therefore, this has been a kind of inflationary aspect. He's saying. And this is the point he's trying to say here, the danger of this. That if you're using silver as a means of exchange, then okay. Silver here going to India, that's great. But the silver going now to Europe and staying in Europe and becoming a part of the mechanism of European currency, that is inflation. So if the silver is now just being used as something that I'm transferring to buy something over here, and not using it internally with it. It's just like the U.S. This is also what we can say what happens with so-called the dollar. Um, the United States, immediately after the Cold War, the money supply of the United States dramatically increased. Dramatically increased right immediately 1989, 99, 101. And in fact, from basically 1989, 90 to the early thousands. I think the money supply maybe. I mean, if you look at M1, hold on. Okay, I mean, I just quickly looked at something. I mean, it basically significantly doubled in the sense that it kind of went up. Now, the reason for this was that the dollar became, as the collapse of the Soviet Union, the dollar became kind of an international currency. Well, why wasn't there this massive inflation at that time? The inflation, why wasn't there? There was inflation, but it was not huge in the United States. Why? Because those dollars did not come to the United States. They were being exchanged in Eastern Europe, within foreign countries, amongst themselves. It will only become inflationary once those dollars come back into the U.S. market. And this is what the point about this is. This is what, and the real inflation we see today is a byproduct of all the massive domestic spending starting with the bailouts in 2008 and the massive quantitative easing, right? So-called quantitative easing of the mid 2000s, 2008, 2010, 2008 onwards, right? In 2010s. And then the 2020 COVID was spending, which really went exponential. So that's why the inflation we have now, that because mostly is domestic spending, and that's the danger. This is what he says here about the effects of silver, right? This is why if you have all that silver, all that money, it didn't, printing the money back then, and immediately after the Cold War, didn't have an impact Montesquieu would say, is because it was just being used. In fact, the reason why we did it, the United States did it, was to stabilize the transitions of those economies. Not, in other words, giving them a means of being able to engage in commerce and trade with each other, and how using the dollar. There was the U.S. dollar and then the foreign U.S. dollar. There was like just two different dollars in that sense, and I think this is what he's talking about here about this question. Now, chapter 6, for what reason the price of usury diminished by half on the discovery of the Indies? Okay, usury was. In other words, he says, what was the reason why the price of usury diminished by half on the discovery of the Indies? Um, uh, uh, um, Gracleso de Vega, El Inca, says that the incomes in Spain, which were at 10%, fell to 5% after the conquest of the Indies. This had to be so. A great quantity of silver was suddenly brought to Europe. Soon, fewer persons needed silver. The price of everything increased, and that of silver diminished. The proportion was, therefore, the proportion was therefore distributed. All the old debts were annulled. One recalls the times of the system. Um, this is this was John Law's plan. John Law, right? And this is B refers to the system under John Law, right? This is that the system when everything had great value except silver. After the conquest of the Indies, those who had silver were obliged to lower the prices or the rental, that is, the interest on their merchandise. Since that time, loans have not been made at the former rates because the quality of silver has increased every year in Europe. Further, as the price of public fund, as the public funds of some few states, founded on the wealth that commerce has produced for them, gave a very modest interest. The contrast to individuals, the contracts of individuals had to be regulated by that. In other words, the interest because of production of commerce, the wealth, the prof, the wealth was procured by them was modest, a modest interest, right? A modest interest, and because of that, it had to be regulated by that fact, the modest interest. It wasn't this great interest, usury. Finally, as the exchange has made it uncommonly easy for men to carry silver from one country to another, silver could not be scarce in one place without flooding in from those places where it was plentiful. So once all of a sudden there was this no longer scarcity, and without scarcity there was no longer an ability to have high interest for it. Right? Chapter 7: How the price of a thing is fixed when wealth in signs vary. Okay. So therefore, if the signs vary, if the value of the wealth, that when wealth in signs vary like anything, inflation, the price is fixed. The price of silver is the price of commodities or product or produce. But how can this price be fixed? Right. That is, by what proportion of silver will things be represented? If one compares the mass of silver and gold in the world to the total of the commodities there are, it is certain that each kind of produce or commodities can be compared to a certain portion of the entirety of gold and silver. So therefore, compare all the productions of things are produced and things of that to those of this. As the total of one is to the total of the other, the one of part of the one will be part of the other. Let us assume that there is only a single product or commodity in the world. In other words, there's only one single product or one commodity, or that there is only one that is purchased, and that it is divisible like silver. A part of that commodity will correspond to a part of the quantity of silver. So one good, but that can be broken up. That one thing can be broken up like silver. Okay, so that part of that commodity. In other words, let's assume there's only one commodity, and that's so and therefore that one thing can be broken up, like the different parts of silver can be broken up. Half of the total of one to half of the total of the other. The tenth or the hundredth or the thousandth of the one to the tenth, hundredth, and thousandth the other. But as what forms property among men is not uh, is not all in commerce at the same time, because metals or monies, which are the sign of it, are not all there at the same time. Either prices will be fixed in a compound ratio of the total things in commerce with the total of the signs that are there, as the things not and as the things not in commerce today can be there tomorrow, and as the signs not there today can likewise return there. The establishment of a price of things always depends fundamentally on the ratio of the total of things to the total of signs. So therefore, this is the idea. His argument here is that there's this ratio, always this ratio between the produces and goods and the symbols of this, and therefore there has to be this balance. If you have an increase of one, what's going to happen is the proportion of this is going that then the percentage of what to that will change in regards to it, right? There must be some kind of proportionality. There'll be this always depend upon these things. Thus, the price thus the prince or the magistrate can no more assess the value of commodities than he can establish by ordinance that the relation of one to 10 is equal to that of 1 to 20. Julian caused a horrible famine when he lowered the price of produce at Antioch. Okay, this is 11. This is from Socrates, the Historic of Ecclesiastes, book 2, right? Talks about this. So let's think about that for a second. About you can't do this. In other words, it's about a ratio. It's simply just it's a fact of ratios. He's saying that that you cannot have a prince who tries to do this. What he will only do is cause people will just find other means around it. In other words, if he says that, then people won't. What happens is they will find a means to get the value that the goods that the things are worth by ignoring the decision, or they won't buy things, or they won't sell things. It will cause a horrible famine, it says, when he lowered the price at the Antioch, right? This is unintended consequences of an act, right? Continuation, chapter 8, continuation, same subject. The blacks on the coast of Africa have a sign of values without money. It is purely an ideal sign, funded on the degree of esteem they have in mind for each commodity as proportion to their need of it. So their esteem, in other words, the blacks in African coasts have a value for money. That's not signs, an ideal one. It's based on the combination of their esteem they have for each commodity in proportion to their need. A certain product or commodity is worth 3 makruts, another 6 makruts, another 10 makruts. It is as if they simply said 3, 6, and 10. So 10 makruts. Right? The price is formed by the comparison they make of all the commodities with each other. So there is nothing that is only money, but each kind of commodity is money for the other. So therefore, this ratio, this. There's no money. It is simply just that there's a arbitrary mechanism, right? There's each kind of commodity is money for the other. Let us, for the moment, bring that way of evaluating things here and join it to our own. All the commodities and products of the world, or even all the commodities or products of one state in particular, considered separately from all the others, will be worth a certain number of maracuts. and dividing the silver of the state into as many parts as there are Americas. Each of these divided parts of silver will be the sign of America. In other words, you can convert. There is this. In other words, it's all ratios, and once you have a ratio, you can make comparative ratios. Right? It assumes that the quality of silver is the quality of silver in a state doubles. There will have to be twice as much silver for each Maracoup. But if doubling silver, you also double the Maracouts, the proportion remain as it was before. Either one of as if before, either one of them doubled. If since the discovery of the Indies, gold and silver had increased in Europe in the ratio of 1 to 20, the price of produce and commodities should have risen in proportion to 1 to 20. But if, on the other hand, the numbers of commodities has increased as 1 to 2, the price of these commodities and the products will have had to rise on the one hand in the ratio of 1 to 20, and fall at the ratio of 1 to 2, and will constantly be at the ratio of and will constantly be in the ratio of 1 to 10. So what is he saying? That in other words, that the relationship of commodities of the product of silver have increased 1 to 20, but that this should have led to the price of commodities going to 120 also, right? Right? Commodities should have written to 1 to 20, right? But on the one hand, the number of commodities didn't do this; it increased only 1 to 2. That means that the number of commodities had to increase at a ratio 1 to 10, right? Had to increase at a 1 to 10 ratio, so that it could equal that of that ratio, right? So the quantities, commodities, and produce grows with its increase in commerce. So as more commerce and more products are made, that's the quantity of products increase. The increase in commerce will increase in silver that follows it, with new communication to the new lands and new seas, which gives it new produce and new commodities. So the more commerce, the more communication with new places, new commerce would begin. Okay. Um, Chapter 9, on the relative scarcity of gold and silver. In addition to the positive abundance and scarcity of gold and silver, there is also abundance of there is also a relative abundance and scarcity of one of these metals to the other. So, avarice men hoard gold and silver because they do not want to consume. As they do not want to consume, they love the signs that cannot be destroyed. They would rather hold gold and silver because they fear losing it, and they can hide. They can hide. They can better hide the one with the smaller volume. Therefore, gold disappears when silver is common, because everyone has some to hide. It reappears when silver is scarce, because one is obliged to remove it from the hiding spot. Nietzsche's. It is therefore a rule. Gold is common when silver is scarce, and gold is scarce when silver is common. One senses the difference between relative abundance and scarcity, and real abundance and scarcity, about which I shall speak at greater length. Therefore, in other words, if silver is then gold is everywhere used, but when the silver is gold is not everywhere used. And maybe this will be kind of an example of when there's abundance, right, and scarcity. Chapter 10 on exchange. Now, chapter 10 on exchange, yeah, this is the long one. This will be 30 paragraphs. So 30 paragraphs. So let's see. The relative abundance and scarcity of the monies of various countries form what is called the exchange, right? The exchange. In this chapter, and generally in Montesquieu, there is no distinction between the exchange as a process and the institution or place where the process ordinary takes place. This makes the language somewhat difficult, right? There's no distinction. The exchange, that whereas the process of exchange, where exchange, and the place, right? The exchange fixes the present and temporary values of monies. So that the exchange was where the monies are going to be going from one country to another country. Silver as a metal has a value like all other commodities. And it also has a value that comes from its capacity to become a sign of another commodity. And if it were only a simple commodity, it must not be doubted that it would lose much of its price. So if it were only a simple commodity, it would kind of maybe lose the price. Silver as money has a value that the prince can fix in some respects and cannot fix in other respects. So the prince can say silver is this much for this one, but then another problem, he can fix it at some respects, but not at all respects, other respects. This is like this. The prince establishes a proportion between a quality of silver as a metal and the same as the quantity as money. He fixes the proportion um, between the various metals used as money. 3. He establishes the weight and grade for each coin. Finally, he gives each coin an ideal value I have mentioned. I shall call the value of money in these 4 relations positive value, because it can be fixed by law. So therefore, positive value is something that law fixes. And he does it in 4 ways. The proportion between a quality civil and the as a metal and the same quality as money. He fixes a proportion between the various metals used as money. He establishes the weight and grade of each coin, and finally gives ideal value to the coin in question. And he gives of this. Now these 4 relations, right, are a positive value. The money of each state has, in addition, a relative value in the sense that it is compared with the money of other countries. It is this relative value that the exchange establishes. So he establishes this. The prince deals with the positive. The prince or the lawgivers or the laws of it deals with the positive values. The relative value is determined by the exchange. It is this relative value that the exchange establishes. It depends largely on the positive value. It depends on the positive value. It is fixed by the most general esteem of the traders and cannot be fixed by the ordinance of princes, because it varies endlessly and depends on 1,000 circumstances. So therefore, it largely, in other words, it depends largely on positive values. It does. It is fixed by the most general esteem, or the judge, the esteem, how much they value it, right, of the traders, and cannot be fixed by by simple ordinance of princes. Because why? Because it varies endlessly. It varies, the esteem by the traders varies endlessly depending on 1,000 circumstances. In order to fix the relative value, in order to fix the relative value, various nations will regulate themselves for the most part by the nation that has the most silver. Right? So therefore, they regulate themselves for the most silver. If it has as much silver as all the others together, each will certainly have to measure itself by that one. This will make the others regulate themselves against the one one another more or less as they have measured themselves against the principal nation. Right. So therefore, this is the principal nation. At the present state of the universe, Holland is the nation which we have referred. Let us examine the exchange in relation to that country. In Holland, there's a coin called the florin. The florin is worth 20 sous, or 40 half groschen. In order to simplify the idea, Let us imagine that there are no florins in Holland and that were only groschen there. A man with a 4,000 florin will have 40,000 groschen, and so forth. Now, the exchange with Holland consists in knowing how many groschen each coin of the other country is worth, and one usually counts by écu of 3 livres in France. The counts by écus of 3 livres in France. The exchange will ask how many groschen as an écru as an écru of 3 livres is worth. If the exchange is at 54, the écru of 3 livres will be worth 54 groschen. If at 60, it will be worth 60. If the silver is scarce in France, the écru of 3 livres will be worth more groschen. If abundant, it will be worth fewer groschen. This scarcity or abundance causing an alteration in the exchange is not real scarcity or abundance. It's relative scarcity or abundance. For example, when France has more need to have funds in Holland than the Dutch need them in France, silver is called common in France and scarce in Holland, and vice versa. So in other words, they need this more than that, like this, and they'll play with the value of the question of scarce, how rare and scarce. Let us assume that the exchange with Holland is at 54. If France and Holland make up only one town, one would do what one does when making changes of an écu. The Frenchman would take will take 3 livres from his pocket, and the Dutchman would take 54 groschen from his own. But as soon as there's a distance between Paris and Amsterdam, but as there is a distance between Paris and Amsterdam, the one who gives me for my écu of 3 livres, the 54 groschen one has in Holland, must give me a letter of exchange for 54 groschen against Holland. Here it is no longer a question of 54 groschen, but of a letter for 54 groschen. Thus, in order to judge the scarcity or abundance of silver, one must know if there are in France more letters of 54 groschen destined for France than there are écus destined for Holland. If there are many letters offered by the Dutch and few écus offered by the French, silver is scarce in France and common in Holland, and the exchange must rise. And one must give more than 54 groschen for my écu. Otherwise, I would not relinquish it, and vice versa. They would not buy it. Okay. One sees that the various operations of exchange form an account of receipts and expenses that must always be brought into balance, and that a state that owes repays others no more through the exchange than an individual pays his debts by changing his silver. So, in other words, this idea that states balance their debts, balance their relations to this, and they would pay, and other people pay by changing his silver. All right. I assume that there are only 3 states in the world: France, Spain, and Holland. That various individuals in Spain owe France the values of 100,000 marks of silver, and that various individuals in France owe 110,000 marks to Spain, and that some circumstances make everyone in Spain and in France suddenly want to have their silver back. That would be the question. What would be the question of the exchange? It would repay the 2 nations reciprocally in the amount of 100,000 marks. In the amount of 100,000 marks. But France would continue to owe 10,000 marks to Spain, and the Spanish would still have a letter against France for 10,000 marks, and France would have none at all against Spain. Now, if Holland, if Harlan's situation with France was reversed, and that if, in order to bring the account into balance, it owed France 10,000 marks, France could pay Spain in two ways: either by giving its letter of credit, giving by giving its creditors in Spain letters payable by its debtors in Holland in the amount of 10,000 marks, or by sending 10,000 marks of silver silver coins to Spain. From this, it follows that when a state needs to remit sums of money to another country, it is by nature of the thing indifferent whether silver should be sent there or letters of exchange should be given. The better way of paying depends solely on the immediate circumstances. One will have to see what, at the time, will give more groschen in Holland, silver, silver carried in species, or a letter payable in Holland for the same amount. So, which is the better situation? What is the better, most advantageous situation? Right? When the same grade and the same weight of silver in France give me the same weight and same grade in silver in Holland, the exchange is said to be on par. And in the present state of monies, par is about 54 groschen per ecu. If the exchange is above 54 groschen, it can be said to be high. When it is below, it can be said to be low. In order to know whether the state loses or gains in a certain situation of exchange, it must be considered as debtor or as creditor, as seller and as buyer. In other words, it has to be understood in terms of its creditor, or debtor, or buyer and seller. Who gets the advantage? Who gains? Who's the winner and loser? Right? When the exchange is lower than par, the state loses as debtor and gains as creditor. It loses as buyer and gains as seller. So this is that interesting point. That in other words, the exchange is lower by par, right? The state loses as a debtor, but it gains as a creditor. It loses as a buyer, but gains as a seller. It may be seen that the loss as debtor, for example, when France owes Holland a certain number of groschen, the fewer groschen its echo is worth, the more ecus will be needed to pay its debt. Whereas in France, if France is the creditor for a certain number of groschen, the fewer groschen each ecu is worth, the more ecu it will receive. The state also loses as buyers. For the same amount of groschens it needs in order to buy the same quantity of commodities. And when the exchange drops, each France echo gives a few groschen. For the same reason, the state gains as seller. I sell my commodities to Holland for the same amount of groschen I sold it before. I shall then have more ecus in France when I procure one echo with 50 groschens than when I have 54. In order, I have to have 54 in order to have the same ecu. The reverse of this will all occur in the other state. If Holland owes a certain number of ecus, it will gain, and if it is owed, it will lose. If it sells, it will lose. If it buys, it will gain. Something more must be said about this. When exchange is below par, for example, it is if it is at 50-50 against 54. What should happen is that France, sending 54,000 ecus to Holland by exchange, would buy commodities for only 50,000, and on the other hand, Holland, sending the value of 50,000 ecus to France, should buy commodities for 54,000. This would make the difference of eight 8/54ths. That is of more than a seventh loss for France, so that one would have to send to Holland a seventh more in silver or commodities than it did when the exchange was on par. And with the ills continuing to exist, because such a debt would lower the exchange still further, France would in the end be ruined. It seems, I say, that this should happen, and yet it does not, because the principle I have established everywhere, which is states tend to bring themselves into balance and liberate themselves. Thus, they borrow only in proportion to that which they can pay, and buy only as much they can sell. Okay. So notice this. This is like 16. This is what, see book 20, chapter 21 above. So that's that general thing. See book. So this is book 20, chapter 21, which was yeah, chapter 20, book 20, 21. This. I don't really want to go there on the screen, but I'll just pay attention to it here. Yeah, yeah, book 16, chapter 21, which is a short chapter on the commerce of the nobility and the monarchy. It is against the spirit of commerce for nobility to engage in the monarchy. It's pernicious for towns and persons that's work. It is against the spirit of monarchy for the nobility to engage in commerce. Um, Now this can't be right. Is this? Let me see. I'm doing this. I'm doing this. Book 20, chapter 21. Okay, so I'm looking at this. Maybe that's an error. And chapter 21 is about the commerce of nobility and the monarchy, right? That it is against the spirit of commerce for a nobility to engage in it. That's weird. The reference in the note doesn't seem right. It is against the spirit of a monarchy um, uh, 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 for an ability to engage in commerce. The usage that permitted commerce in the nobility in England is that one thing must is one of the things that most contributed to the weakening of monarchical government there. So the idea is that you shouldn't let the aristocracy be part of commerce. If you do that, it weakens the monarchy, weakens the things. So I say it should happen. Not so. Therefore, this weakens the center of power. That states tend to bring themselves into balance and liberate themselves. Thus, they borrow proportion to what they can pay and buy what they can sell. And taking from the example, the exchange falls in France from 54 to 50. The Dutchman who brought commodities from France will pay 1,000 écus, and who paid 54,000 groschen for them would not pay more than 50,000 for them if the Frenchman wanted to agree to it. But the French commodity will gradually raise in price. The profit will be divided between the Frenchman and Dutchman. For the trader readily divides his profit when he can gain. There the profit will spread between the Frenchman and the Dutchman. In the same way, the Frenchman who bought Dutch commodities for 50,000 groschen and is paid for them with 1,000 écus, when the exchange was at 54, would be obliged to add 50 fourths more in French écus in order to buy the same commodities. But the French merchant who will feel the loss he would suffer will want to give less for the Dutch commodity. The loss will spread between the French merchant and the Dutch merchant. The state will be imperceptibly the state will imperceptibly bring itself into balance, and the lowering of the exchange will not have all the drawbacks as one has feared. So, what is he saying here? He's saying that I think that note is the wrong note here in the text, so let's not pay attention to that line because it didn't really seem to be relevant. So, oops, this is where maybe you should not always pay attention to the notes. he's saying that what's happening is the traders will do it because the, the traders will write things among themselves in that sense and balance things out. This is an interesting point. He's saying that yes, it's between these things, and yes, it would you would see that, but the actors involved are benefiting, and therefore they're making profit. So therefore, this will ultimately right itself. Even this debt should happen. They're getting something from this that is incommensurable. So, what is the incommensurable thing that they're getting? And maybe this can be leveraged as a way to, well, maybe that, okay, and have the drawbacks that was feared. When the exchange is rolled in par, the trader can, without decreasing his fortune, remit his fund to foreign current countries, because on receiving them he regains what he has lost. But a prince who sends to foreign countries only a silver that can never return always loses. So you send silver, that's always going to lose. So therefore, if I exchange merchants, I can always convert my currency over here and do something over here. So therefore, so when traders do a great deal of business in a country, the exchange uh, infallibly rises. This occurs because one undertakes many engagements and buys more commodities, and one draws on the foreign country in order to pay them. If a prince masses a great quantity of silver in his state, the silver there may be scarce really and common relatively. For example, if at the same time the state has to pay for many commodities in a foreign country, the exchange would be lowered though silver was scarce. The exchange everywhere always tends to bring itself into a certain proportion. And this is in the very nature of the thing itself, so the proportion. If the exchange from Ireland to England is lower than par, and if that from England to Holland is also lower by par, then that from Ireland to Holland will be even lower. And that is the ratio, in a ratio compounded of that from Ireland to England and that from England to Ireland. For a Dutchman who can have his funds immediately sent indirectly from Ireland by way of England will not want to pay dearer to make them come directly. I say that I say that it should be thus, but it does not occur exactly this way. There are always circumstances that make things vary, and that the difference of the profit made by drawing them from one place or another lies in the art of particular cleverness of bankers, which is not the issue here. So therefore, this is how maybe this larger point about ratios this should be. But then there's bankers, and I'm not going to deal with the banker. The cleverness of bankers can play a game here that do this a certain way and make more things. When a state raises its money, for example, when it calls 6 livres or 2 ekros, what it formerly only called only 3 or 1, the new denomination, which adds nothing to real to the ekros, should not produce a single groschen more in the exchange. One should get for the 2 ekros only the same amount of groschen one received for the old one. And if this is not the case, it is the result of the rate set for money itself, but rather of the newness and its suddenness. The exchange is concerned with business that has already begun and corrects itself only after a certain time. So there's going to be a gap with the rules, and there's going to be inequality. When a state, instead of raising its money by a law, makes a recoinage in order to turn a strong money into a weak one, it happens that there are two sorts of money during the same operation: the strong, which is the old, and the weak, which is the new one. And the strong one is depreciated by proclamation and accepted only at the mint, and as letter of exchange constantly have to be paid in the new species. It seems that the exchange would regulate itself by the new species. If, for example, the weakening in France were by half, and if the old écru and the new of 3 leu gave 60 groschen in Holland, the new écru should give 30 groschen. Sorry, hiccups. On the other hand, it seems that the exchange should regulate itself by the value of the old species, because the banker who has some silver and who takes letters obliged to carry the old species to the mint in order to have new species on which he loses. Therefore, the exchange will be the value of the new species and that of the old. The value of the old species falls, so to speak, both because the new species is already used in commerce and because the banker cannot hold strictly to either, as it is his interest to take the old silver quickly from his till in order to put it to work, and as he is forced to do so to make payments. And on the other hand, the value of the new species rises, so to speak, because the banker with the new species is in the same circumstance, which allows him, as well as we show, to procure old species to his advantage. Therefore, the exchange will the exchange will set itself up, as I've said, between the new species and the old. So the bankers profit by sending the old species out of the state, because they gain for themselves in the same way the advantage they would have by the exchange regulated on the old species, that is, many groschen in Holland, and also because the exchange they return is to regulate it between the new species and the old species, that is, it is lower. This process procures many accords in France. I assume that 3 livres of the old species make, by the present exchange, 45 groschen, and by carrying the same echo to Holland, one would have 60. But with a letter of 54 groschen, one would produce a euchre of 3 livres in France, which, carried in old species to Holland, will get at 60 groschen. Therefore, all the old species will leave the state that makes the recoinage, and the profit will go to the bankers. So the bankers make the profit, he's saying. In order to remedy this, one will be forced to perform a new operation. The state which does the recoinage will itself send a great quantity of the old species to the nation that regulated the exchange, and procuring a credit for itself there. This will make the exchange raised to the point that one will have nearly as many groschen by the exchange as a liquor of 3 livres as one would have by sending an écru of 3 livres and old coins out of the country. I say very nearly because when the profit is modest, one will not be tempted to send coins out because of the expense carrying it and the risk of confiscation. Right? It is well to give a clear idea of this. Mr. Bernard Law, or any other bankers the state wants to use, offer his letters to Holland at 1, 2, or 3 groschen higher than the immediate exchange. He has supply in foreign countries of the old species that he has continued sent out. Therefore, he has made the exchange raised to the point mentioned above. Still, by giving letters, he collects all the new species and forces the other bankers who have payments to make to take their old species to the mint, and moreover, he had impetuously taken all the silver. He constrains the other bankers in their turn to give him letters at a very high rate of exchange. The profit at the end indemnifies him in the large part from the loss at the beginning. So that one senses that during this entire operation, the state has to suffer a violent crisis. Silver will become very scarce there. 1, because most of it will be depreciated by proclamation. 2, because part of it will have to be carried into foreign countries. And 3, because everyone will keep it under lock. and no one will want to leave to the prince a profit one hopes to have for himself. It is dangerous to do it slowly. It is dangerous to do it quickly. If the if the gain expected is immoderate, the drawbacks increase accordingly. It has been seen above. It has been seen above that when the exchange was lower than the species, there was a profit in sending silver out, and for the same reason. When it is higher than the species, there was a profit in bringing it back in. But there is a case in which one finds profit in having the species leave the country, though the exchange is on par. It is when one sends it to foreign countries to have it marked again and recoined. When it returns, one makes a profit on the money, whether one uses it in the country or one takes it for foreign countries. So therefore, you take the money and have it recoined. If it happens that in a state one makes a company having a considerable number of shares and made the value of the first purchase rise 20 or 25 times within a few months, and that same state has established a bank whose notes were to serve the function of money, and that the numerical value of those notes was prodigiously high in order to correspond to the prodigiously high numerical value of the shares. This is Mr. Law's system. Here, Montesquieu is kind of, this is Montesquieu's Law's system, right? This is the bubble. This is the creation of the bubble, right? It would follow from the nature of the thing that these shares and notes would be destroyed in the same way they had been established. One could not have made the shares suddenly rise to 20 or 25 times their original value without giving many people the means of procuring immense wealth on paper. Each one would seek to secure his fortune, and as the exchange provided the easiest routes for changing its nature or for sending it where one wants, one could continually remit a part of one's effect to the nation that regulated the exchange. A plan of continually remitting it to foreign countries would make the exchange fall. The exchange would collapse. Let us assume at the time of the system, with respect to the grade and weight of silver money, the exchange was at 40 groschen per ecu. And when innumerable pieces of paper had become money, one wanted to give no more than 39 groschen per ecu, then no more than 38, 37, etc. This went so far that no one gave more than 8 groschen, and finally there was no longer an exchange. The exchange broke down. The exchange, no more buying it. No more, this paper, no, I'm not going to buy it, I'm going to exchange it. The exchange in this case should have regulated the proportion of silver to paper in France. I assume that by the weight and grade of the silver, the ecu of 3 livres of silver was worth 40 groschen, and that when the exchange was done in paper, the ecu of 3 livres in paper was worth only 8 groschen. The difference was 4/5. Therefore, the ecu of 3 livres in papers was worth 4/5 less than the ecu of that of silver. That's the real thing of it, right? Whew. And this is now 11. What's going on here with this errors? This is 11, chapter 11. On the operations performed, this is a weird thing, it's 2 it says, on the operations of the Romans performed on money. Whatever acts of authority have been performed on monies in our time in France, in 2 consecutive ministries, the Romans preferred even greater ones. Not at the time of the corrupt republic, or at the time of the republic which was only anarchy, but when having the full force of the institution, as much as by wisdom as by courage. After vanquishing the towns of Italy, it, it disrupted the empire with it disputed empire with Carthaginians. So it performed it many times, like it says. In France, the Romans performed it many times. Not at the time of the corrupt republic or at the time the republic was an anarchy, but when it was in full force and by its wisdom and by its courage after vanquishing the Italian towns and disputed the empire of Carthage. I'm very glad to pursue this matter somewhat further, so that an example will not be of something made of something that is not one. In the First Punic War, as with which was supposed to be of one, which was supposed to be of 1/20 ounce of copper, weighed only 2, and in the Second Punic War it weighed only 1. This retrenching corresponds to what we today call expansion of the currency. To remove half the silver from an écru of 6 livres in order to make 2 écus, or to make it worth 12 livres, is precisely the same thing. There remains no records of the way the Romans performed this operation in the First Punic War, but what they did in the second points to a remarkable wisdom. The Republic was not in a position to pay its debts. And as weighed 2 ounces of copper, and the denarius, valued at 10 arses, weighed 20 ounces of copper. The Republic made the as of 1 copper made the as as plural of 1 ounce of copper. This is Pliny again. And it gained half on its creditors. It paid a denarius with these 10 ounces of copper. This operation gave the state a great jolt. It should have been as small as possible. The operation contained an injustice. It should have been as small as possible. It was its object was the liberation of the republic from its citizens. It could not, therefore, have been the liberation of the citizens from themselves. So, in other words, the debtors. Thus, themselves. This brought a second operation, the one that ordered the denarius, which had until then been only 10 ounces, would contain 16. It resulted from this double operation that while the creditors of the Republic lost half, those of the individuals lost only a fifth. Commodities increased only a fifth. The real change in the money was only a fifth. The other consequence can be seen. Therefore, in other words, the people selling it, they felt only this. The real and the creditors really was clobbered in that sense. Therefore, the Romans conducted themselves better than we, who in our operations have induced both public fortunes and individual fortunes. So therefore, public fortunes and individual fortunes. Individual fortunes are not really hurt here. The individual lost only a fifth. The public thing lost half, but the individual level, this is not done this way. The Romans therefore did double operation, right? And therefore, that is not all. One sees that they perform these in circumstances more favorable than our situations. Okay? Number 12, chapter 12, the circumstances which the Romans performed these operations of the money. Long ago, there were very little silver or gold in Italy. This country has a few, few, if any, gold or silver mines. When Rome was taken by the Gauls, there were only 1,000 pounds of gold there. Still, the Romans sacked several powerful towns and carried their wealth home. For a long time, they used only copper money. It was only after the Peace of Paris they had enough silver to make money of it. They made the denare with this metal, which was valued at 10 arses, or 10 pounds of copper. Wherefore the proportion of silver to copper was 1 to 960, as the Roman denarius was valued at 10 arses, or 10 pounds of copper, and was valued at 120 ounces of copper. And at the same time, a denarius was valued at an eighth of an ounce of silver. This gave the proportion we have just mentioned, right? F, which was they were 12 ounces in a Roman pound or livre, right? When Rome became the master of this part of Italy, with Greece and Sicily as her closest neighbor, little by little it found itself between two rich peoples, the Greeks and the Carthaginians. Its silver increased at home. As its proportion of 1 to 960 between silver and copper could no longer be sustained, Rome performed various operations on monies, of which we know nothing. We know only that at the beginning of the Second Punic War, the Roman denarius was valued at only 20 ounces of copper, and that the proportion between the silver and the copper was 1 to 160, versus 1 to to 6. Yeah, 1 to 960. The reduction was quite considerable, for the Republic gained 5/6 of all the copper money, but one had done only what the nature of thing required, and had reestablished a proportion between the metals that served as money. The peace that ended the first Punic Law had left the Romans masters of Sicily. They soon entered Sardinia. They began to know Sicily. The stock of silver continued to increase in Spain, and operations were performed, reducing the silver denarius from 20 ounces to 16. It had the effect of putting silver and copper back in proportion. This proportion of 1 to 160 had been this proportion was 1 to 600. It had been 1 to 128. Study the Romans. Their superiority will never be more evident than the choices of circumstances in which they did good and evil things. In other words, if they had to do something bad, it was because there was necessity. If they did good things because it was beneficial. This is the point. A very interesting point. Chapter 13. The operations on monies at the time of the emperors. And in the operation performed in the monies of the emperor, one proceeded by way of retrenchment. The state disclosed its needs to the people and did not try to seduce them. Under the emperors, one proceeded by alloying metals. These princes, reduced to despair by their very liberalities, were obliged to tamper with the monies. An indirect path which decreased the ill, but appeared not to touch it. One took back part of the gift and hid one's hand, and without speaking of decrease in pay or largesse, these were diminished. So therefore, they tampered with the coinage. Right? One can still see in some collections what are called plated medals, which have a shelf of silver covering the copper. This money is discussed in a fragment of Dio's book, Book 77, in Book 77. 28 again. The extracts of virtues and vices in Dio's book on the extracts of virtues and vices. Right. Didas Janus began the weakening. One finds the money of Heraclius was more than half alloy, that of Alexander Severus 2/3. The weakening continued, and under Gallienus, one only saw silvered copper. Um, One can feel these violent operations could not occur in our time. A prince would deceive himself and would deceive no one else. The exchange has taught the bankers to compare all the monies of the world and set them at their just value. The grade of monies can no longer be kept secret. If a prince begins to alloy precious metals with copper, everyone continues to do so, and does it for him. The strong species leave first and return to him weakened. If this is Grisham's law, right? And if the Roman emperors had weakened silver without weakening gold, he would have seen gold suddenly disappear, and he would have been reduced to his bad silver. The exchange, as I have said in the preceding book, has curtailed the great acts of authority, or at least make success of its at least the success of great acts of authority. Now, in other words, there was no at the time of the Roman Empire. There was no exchange. There was only one place, Rome. So the emperor could get away with it because there was no exchange. Looking at this and saying, "Oh, this is the value of this." So this is what it means. The concept of exchange. But this is Montesquieu's point, that this exchange only works when there is multiple states, and that there is no greater authority over it. Once there is a greater authority, like an emperor, then the exchange dies. That's a point. This is actually something. Therefore, Montesquieu here in chapter 13 points to the fundamental limit of what globalism can accomplish. Because once you have a global state with a global authority, the exchanges by which regulates the effects of these things are gone. So what limits state power, in other words, what limits why princes of today cannot do what the Roman emperors did, is because there's exchanges. It makes it difficult for them to do, and they won't do it. They can't hold it secret, and therefore that's interesting. The argument here is that the reason why you can't have a global state is that it will destroy the very engine of globalism. So that's the interest that would restrain it. Okay, that's the interest. They destroy the global market. Ooh, maybe that's why communists want it, right? That's why. Chapter 14: How exchanges hamper despotic states. So, in other words, exchanges hamper despotic states. Muscovy tried to leave. Muscovy tried to leave its despotism. It cannot. The establishment of commerce requires the establishment of exchanges, and the operation of exchange contradicts all the laws of Muscovy. In 1745, the Czarina made an ordinance driving the Jews out because they had sent to foreign countries the silver of those who had been exiled to Siberia and that of the foreigners who were in her service. The subject of empire, like slaves, were unable to leave or send out their goods without permission. The exchange, which gave the means of transferring silver from one country to another, contradicts, therefore, the laws of Muscovy. Commerce itself is the contradiction of those laws. These people comprise only slaves attached to the land, and slaves called ecclesiastics or gentlemen because they are lords of these slaves. There remains, therefore, scarcely anyone of the third estate, which is formed of of workers and merchants. Right? There's no real third estate of workers and merchants. This is the problem. Reading Montesquieu should cure anyone of the romanticism of Dugin, because here is you have a clear case of Montesquieu showing that what Muscovy is, Russia, it is serfs. Everyone's a slave. It's a despotism. It's a despotic rule. There's no one but slaves and masters. There's no change in this fundamental sense, and this it hampers it in that sense. Chapters 15, the usages of several countries of Italy. In some Italian countries, laws were made to prevent subjects from selling land in order to transfer their silver to foreign countries. These laws could be good ones when the wealth of each state was so much it owns that there was many difficulties in sending it to another. But since by the use of exchange, wealth somehow does not belong to any state in particular, and since it is so easily transferred from one country to another, it is a bad law that one does not allow one to dispose of one's lands for one's business when one can dispose of one's silver. This law is bad because it gives the advantage to movable effects over land, because it makes foreigners dislike coming to and establishing themselves in the country. And finally, because one can invade it. One can easily evade it. So this was a good law when this was not; these exchanges did not exist. That you limit land, saying you can't convert land into or sell land into silver. But once you have a market or exchange, it's easy to avoid it. People are not going to invest. This will make you. Chapter 16 on the aids of the state that can draw from bankers. Bankers are made in order to change silver and not to lend it. So therefore, the bankers are made in order to change silver, not to lend it. If the prince uses them only to change his silver, and his affairs are always extensive, the slightest profit he gives the bankers for their remittances becomes considerable, and if profits are asked of the prince, he can be sure that it was due to a fault in administration. When, on the other hand, bankers are used for making advances of silver, their art consists of producing large profits from it for themselves, without anyone being able to accuse them of usury. So this is the problem: is it's you can use as a medium to exchange silver to exchange as an exchange, banks as an instrument of exchange is not a problem. But once you start borrowing from a bank, a prince becomes borrowing from a bank. Well, this all of a sudden there's large profit from this. This is why it's maybe not always good to borrow from banks. This is why banks are very conservative. They want to get the best. They want to get capital. They want to make banks are lousy for borrowing from. They'll make you pay more back. Chapter 17 on public debts. Some people have thought that it was good for a state to owe itself. They have thought that this multiplied wealth by increasing circulation. So debt to itself. Right? I believe there had been a confusion between a circulating between a circulating paper that represents money, or a circulating paper that is a sign of the profits of a company has made or will make in commerce, and a paper that represents debt. So therefore, there's a confusion here between money, paper that is a share in a company, and a promissory note, right? A paper that represents debt, a promissory note. The first two are very advantageous to the state. So therefore, the paper, this thing of this that I give out, circulate paper, a sign of a paper, one that represents money, and a paper that circulates the profit a company has or will make in commerce. So therefore, circulating paper, a profit. The paper of this is a share of a company. Yeah, share of a company. The share of a company gets the wealth back of it. That's stock. Stock. And a debt would be what we call, what was debts? Bonds, right? Bonds. A bond. Um, uh, yeah. The first two are advantageous for the state. The third cannot be advantageous. And all that one can expect from it is that it should be a good guarantee of individuals against the nation's debt. That is, it will produce payment of the debt. But here are the drawbacks that result. If foreigners possess such paper that it represents a debt, they draw every year from the nation a considerable interest. So that's don't allow foreigners to buy your debt. This is the stupid thing. This is Montesquieu's warning against what the stupid American central bankers let the Russians and the Chinese do this because that's dangerous. They draw a considerable profit from your country. If a nation thus perpetually indebted, the exchange would be very low, right? The impost levied from the payment of the interest on the debt injures manufacturers by making workmanship more expensive. So therefore, you let the damn foreigners make profit. The debt then therefore makes what? It makes rises the cost of labor in the domestic market. The worker of American workers, in other words, injures manufacturers by making cost worker here. So they have to export worker. See, you have to export it. You have to go there. You can't do it here. This is what led to the sending of jobs overseas, right? Four, the fourth thing that does, one takes the true revenues from the state from those who are active and industrious to transfer them to idle people. That is, one gives the comfort of working to those who do not work, and the difficulties of working to those who do work. Okay, Montesquieu is great here. This is like attack. This is attack on the neoliberal bullshit we have in America. Um, these are the drawbacks. I know with no advantages. 10 persons have 10,000 acres each in revenue from the land or industry. This makes it 5%, a capital of 20,000 acres of the nation. Of these 10 persons, use half of their revenue, that is 50,000 acres, to pay interest on 10,000 acres, on 100,000 acres that they have borrowed from others. This still makes only 2,000 acres, only 200,000 acres for the state. It is in the language of algebra, 20,000 acres minus 10,000 plus 1,000 equals 20,000. 200,000. Okay. Um, so 200,000 minus that plus another 10,000 equals 200,000. What can lead one into error is that a paper representing a debt of a nation is a sign of wealth. For only a rich state could sustain such a paper without falling into decadence. So that if it does not fall, the state must have great wealth from elsewhere. One say that there is no harm in it because there are resources against this ill. But one says that the ill is good because the resources are greater than the ill. So therefore, there's the idea. This is the thing: is that, but once the resources are going, we were able. This is the argument that many people are arguing that America eventually will pay its debt because what will happen is that once the resources are gone, once you destroyed the resources, the capital resources and things like this, then there's no resources, or that therefore, oh my God, it will destroy the nation. And it is destroying the nation in that sense. Chapter 18 on payment of public debts. There must be a proportion between the state as creditor and the state as debtor. The state can be creditor indefinitely, but it can be a debtor only to a certain degree. When it goes beyond it, the status of creditor vanishes. If this state also has a credit that has not been jeopardized, it can do what has been so happily practiced in a European state, and I think that is 33 is England. That is, it can produce a great quality of species and offer remuneration to all individuals unless they want to reduce the interest. Indeed, just as it is individuals who fix the rate of interest when the state borrows, it is the state to fix when the state wants to pay. It is not enough to reduce interest, but the benefit of this reduction must form a fund of amortization. H. Here, see 20, see 20, book 21, 21. This term funds desamortization, which returns a sinking funds. It can be related to the other term that was there. So, okay, let's go back. In other words, a sinking fund, amortization, to pay a part of the capital every year. In other words, this is the money to pay the debt every year, right? The capital. An operation, the operation, the happier as is success increases. An operation, the happier as its success increases every day. When the credit of the state is not complete, there is further reason to seek to form a fund of amortization from this fund. Once established, it restores confidence, right? If the state is a republic whose government is by its nature undertakes, okay. If the state is a republic whose government by its nature undertakes projects that take a long time, the capital of the fund of amortization can be small. In a monarchy, this capital must be large. So a republic can have a small amortized fund because why? It's long projects. But monarchy, this okay. The regulation to one, so that's one thing. If republic small, large, because two, the regulation should be such that all citizens of the state bear the weight of establishing this fund, because they bear the weight of establishing the debt. The creditors must pay the state. The creditors of the state pays himself with the sum he contributes. So the people bear this thing. People have to do it, by the way. Three, there are four classes of people who pay the debt of the state: the owners of land, those who practice their industry through trade, the plowman and the artisan, and the state pensioner or individuals. Of these four classes, the last is a case of necessity, would seem to have to be the least carefully managed, because it is entirely it is an entirely passive class in the state, whereas this same state is sustained by the active forces of the other three. So state pensioners or individuals, this is the passive. The plowman, the artisan, the owners of land, those who practice industry through trade, the plowman and the artisan, so the commerce, those commerce and trade, the plowman and then the craft artisans. But isn't okay? I see what you're saying. So one, two, three, and that's the fourth. This is the one that is least. These are the ones that are active. But one cannot burden it. But as one cannot burden it more without destroying public confidence, in other words, you destroy these more, of which the state in general and these two classes in particular have a sovereign need. As a certain number of citizens cannot lack public faith without appearing to lack it, and as the class of creditors is always the most exposed to the projects of the ministers and is always under their eyes and hands, the state must accord it a singular protection, and the indebted part must never have the slightest advantages over the crediting part. And be careful. So the creditors, you have to have it so that this is the most dangerously exposed. The generating part, but the creditors is the most vulnerable. And they can't have the indebted part can never have the slightest advantage over the crediting part. When that happens, it's all over. Chapter 19 on the lending at interest. Silver is a sign of value. It is clear that he who needs this sign should rent it, as he does everything he needs. As he does everything he needs. He doesn't have it, he needs it, he rents it. The whole difference is that other things can be rented or bought, whereas silver, which is the price of the thing, is rented and not bought. To lend one silver without interest is a very good act, but one senses that this can be only a religious council, not a civil one. If you're renting silver and without interest, then can be religious. You can argue this, but laws require you. In in order for commerce to proceed well, silver must have a price, but this price must be small. If it's too high, the trader who sees that it would cost him more in interest than he would gain in commerce undertakes nothing. So he will. This is the problem of. I think this is the problem of real estate. When real estate was so high, everyone invested in real estate, and real investments and real things became less, and then therefore became the bubble. Right? This becomes a bubble. The trader, in other words, if silver has gain in commerce, he undertakes nothing. If silver has no price, no one lends it, and the trader still undertakes nothing. Right? I am mistaken when I say that no one lends it. The business of society must always go forward. Usury is established, bringing with it the disorder that has been experienced at all times. The law of Muhammad confuses usury with loans with interest. Usury increases in Mohammedan countries in proportion to the severity of the prohibition. The lender indemnifies himself for his perils in infringing the law. So therefore, the increased rate is so high because the risk of it's so high, so the rates have to be high. So the usury is worse. There's a difference between interest is can be something legitimate and reasonable by risk. But usury it's not based on risk. It's extortion or trying to do something it's not reasonable. Okay, so therefore this is the problem, is that this is the mistake in mistaking usury. If you mistake usury and interest, this is what Marxists do. Marxists, interest, or this idea of excess profit. Oh my God, this is a usury. Okay, no, this is just, again, they're like the Mohammedans in that sense. They have an ideology or a belief that, oh my God, I shouldn't. They're acting as though we should be religious, but not civil. They're not understanding this as civil. In those countries of the East, when most men have nothing that is secure, there is almost no relation between the present possession of a sum and the expected of having it after having it back after lending it. Therefore, it usually increases in proportion to the peril of insolvency. Right. In other words, if there's, you can't do it. I don't know. I have to give you a ridiculous amount of money. I'm risking everything. Chapter 20 on maritime usuries. The amounts of maritime usury is founded on two things: the perils of the sea, which makes one risk lending his silver only in order to have much more, and the readiness commerce gives the borrowers to effect business of great consequence. Whereas, since usury on land is founded on neither of these two reasons, it is prescribed by legislators, or more sensibly, kept within just bounds. So therefore, the usury it's getting amortizing risk, right? This is that idea. Chapter 21 on the loan by contract, and on the usury among the Romans, right? In addition to the loan made for commerce, there is another kind of a loan made by civil contract, which results in interest or usury. So therefore, there was a loan by contract. There's loans made because of commerce, but there's loans of civil thing that resulted in usury, right? As among the Romans, the people increased their power every day. The magistrates sought to flatter them and have them make laws that would be the most pleasant for them. They withdrew their capital. They lowered the interest. They forbid it being taken. They removed physical constraints. Finally, the question of the abolition of all debts was brought up every time a tribute wanted to make himself popular. Right. So this is how the Romans handle this. They play this. These continual changes, both by law and by plebiscite, naturalized usury in Rome, as the creditor who saw in the people their debtor, their legislature, and their judge no longer had trust in contracts. The creditors the creditors were not tempted to lend money to the people except at great profits, and discredited debtors, especially because as laws came only from time to time, the people's complaints were continual and always intimidated the creditors. This caused all honest men of borrowing and lending to be abolished in Rome, and a frightful usury, which was repeatedly crushed only to rise again, became established. This is Tacit. This is in the Annals. This evil came from the fact that things this evil came from the fact that things had not been well managed. Extreme laws for good give rise to extreme evil. That's a nice maxim, right? Extreme laws for good gives rise to extreme evil. This is, the people had to pay for the loans of the silver, and the danger of legal penalties. So therefore, they had to pay. People had to pay for the loans of silver and the dangers from legal penalties. Okay? Of this. So this is the Roman example. Now, continuation of the same subject. This is the last chapter, and this is longish, 19 paragraphs, so it's relatively long. The first Romans had no laws to regulate the rate of usury. In the ensuing embroilments between the plebiscites and the patricians, even during the sedition on the Mons Sacra, they know they go through. This is 37, which is that the sacred mound, right? Daron, right? Describes it very well. And, on the one side, only good faith was alleged, and on the other, only harshness of contract. Individual agreements were therefore followed, and I believe that there were ordinary a 12% per year. My reason is that in the old language of the Romans, interest at 6% was called half of usury, interest of 3% a quarter of usury, and the total of usury was therefore an interest at 12%. But if one asks how such high rates of usury could have been established among a people who were almost without commerce, I shall say that this people, who were very often obliged to go to war without pay, very often needed to borrow, and that their expeditions were continuously successful, they found it easy to pay. And this is the sense of the narrative of the embroilment that arose in this regard, that there was no argument with the avarice of those who lent the money, but it was said that those who complained would have been able to pay it if their conduct had not been irregular. Right? This is 39. Sees Appius' speech on the subjects in Don's history of the count. Right? Laws are made, therefore, that affected only the immediate situation. The ordinance is made, for example, that those who enrolled for the war that had to be fought would not be pursued by their creditors. Those who were in irons would be set free, and that the most indigent would take to the colonies. Sometimes the public treasury was open. The people were pacified as their present ills were relieved, and they were asked for nothing. They asked nothing for the future. The Senate was careful not to provide it. At the time, the Senate defended. At the time when the Senate defended so consistently the cause of usury, the Romans loved of poverty, of frugality, and of their mediocrity in fortunes was at its peak. But the constitution was such that the principal citizens bore all the burdens of the state, and the common people paid nothing. How could the former be deprived of the rights to pursue debtors and be asked to fulfill their posts and to fund the pressing needs of the republic? Right? Tacitus says that the laws of the 12th table fix interest at 1% per year. It is clear that he was mistaken, and that he took for a law of the 12 tables another law I shall mention. If the law of the 12 table had ruled that, how was it that one did not use its authority in the dispute that arose at the time between creditors and debtors, right? One finds no vestige of this law about lending at interest. And however little one knows about Roman history, one will see that such a law could not have been the work of the Decemvirs. The Lycian law, Roman year 388, right? The tributes of Delius and Manius had a law passed that reduced the interest to 1% per year. It was this law that Tacitus confuses with the laws of the 12 tables, and that it was the first one of Romans made to fix the rate of interest. 10 years later, this usury was reduced by half. Subsequently, it was entirely removed. And if we are to believe some of the authors had read, this occurred, had believed some of the authors Livy had read. This occurred during the consulate of Marcus Rutilius and Quintus Civilis in the Roman year 413 or 341 BC. This law followed in the path of all laws in which the legislature has carried things to excess. A way was found to avoid it. So the legislature did something to excess, something was found to excess. Many others had to be made to strengthen, correct, and temper it. Sometimes one departed from laws to follow usage. This is, again, the taking of interest was accepted as the old custom. In other words, this is the Roman civil law. In other words, sometimes one departed from usage to follow laws. So you went to custom, ignored laws, followed custom, and now ignored custom, followed laws. But in this case, usage easily prevailed. When a man borrows, he finds an obstacle in every law that he has made in his favor. That law has against it both the one it aided and the one it condemned. As the lender, Sempronius Acilius permitted debtors to act according to law. When he was killed by creditors for having wanted to recall the money of a rigidity they could no longer bear. In other words, he was killed by creditors for having wanted to recall the memory of a rigidity that they could no longer bear. I leave the town to glance briefly at the provinces. I have said elsewhere that the Roman provinces were devastated by a despotic and harsh government. That is not all. They were further devastated by frightful usurers. Cicero says that the people of Salamis wanted to borrow silver from Rome, and that they could not because of the Gabian law. I must explore this law. When loans at interest when loans at interest had been prohibited in Rome, all sorts of ways were devised to avoid this law. As the allies, those of the Latin nations were not subject to the Roman civil law, or allies or Latin who lent his name and appeared to be creditor was used. Therefore, the law had only made the creditors submit to formalities, and the people were not relieved. The people complained of this fraud, and Marcus Sempronius, tribune of the people, by the authority of the Senate, had a plebiscite passed that stipulated that the matters of loans, laws prohibited usurious loans between one Roman citizen and another, would apply equally between citizens and an ally or a Latin. At the time, those called allies were people of the Italian proper, which extended to the Arno and the Rubicon, and was not governed as were Roman provinces. Tacitus says that there were always new invasions of the law checking usuries, but when one could no longer lend or borrow under the name of an ally, It was easier to bring in a man from the province who lent his name. There had to be new laws against these abuses. And when Gallibrius made the famous law whose purpose was to check corruption in voting, he naturally thought that the best way to accomplish it was to discourage borrowing. These two things were naturally bound together, for usury always increased at the time of elections, because silver was needed in order to win votes. One clearly sees that the Gabriel law has extended the census consults sempitertum to the provincial people, as the people of Salmis could not borrow silver in Rome because of this law. Brutus, using borrowed name, lent it to them at 4% per month, and uh, uh, obtained for that 2 Senate consuls. In the first, in which it was said that the loan would not be considered as evading the law, and that the governor of Clylus would judge in accordance with the agreement stipulated in the note of the people of Salmis. Right? So again, 61, this is so that neither the people of Salmis nor those who gave it should be cheated. Right? This is this one. The Gabriel law prohibited loans with interest between peoples of the provinces and Roman citizens, and since the latter that time, all the silver in the world in their hands, they had to be tempted by very high rates of usury, so that in the eyes of the avarice, the danger of losing the debt would disappear. And as in Rome, there were powerful people who intimidated the magistrates and silenced the laws. They were bolder in lending and borrowing and the requiring of high rates of usury. Because of this, the provinces were ravaged one by those who had credit in Rome, and as each governor made his edicts of entering his province, settling the rate of usury that suited him, the avarice assisted legislation, and legislation assisted avarice. So therefore, the governor like this would set the rate, he would do it like this, and then what happened was avarice would then drive the things in usury higher. Business must go forward, and if a state, business must go forward, things must be done. And a state is lost if everything falls into inaction. So therefore, if business collapses in inaction because of this, because of were occasions when towns and corporate bodies and the society of towns and individuals all borrowed, and the need to borrow was only too great, whether to pay for the ravages of the army or the rapacious of the magistrate, for the extortions of men of business, or for the bad usages that were continuing established. One had never been as rich or as poor. The Senate, which had executive power, gave by necessity, often by favor, permission to borrow from citizens, and thereupon made Senate consults. But even these Senate consults were brought into discredit by the law. These Senate consults gave rise to the people's demand for new tables, by which increasing the dangers of the loss of capital increased usuries further. I shall continue to repeat: moderation governs men, not excess. So therefore, you kept on doing restrictive laws, restraint laws. This went to more usages. Therefore, moderate regulations, moderate use laws like this. Be reasonable. In other words, this is that famous line that the more you try to discredit them to people, the people demanded restraint on this, not restraint or curtailment. Then what happened was that this led to further usuries, right? And then people commanded it. So I shall continue to repeat: moderation governs men, not excess. He who pays later, says Uppian, pays less. The legislatures were led by this principle after the destruction of the Roman Republic. When the Roman Republic said that they do it, and he who pays later pays less. And the legislatures were led by this principle. They pays later, pays less, after the destruction of the Roman Republic. And here I think this ends the book. If I remember correctly, this ends the book. So we'll stop here. Any questions or comments, please put them below. And if when I see them, I'll get I will get. This has been a long chapter 2 because it's about money, right? Um, exchange, trade, money, currency, debt, and things like this. Creditors, debtors, and how politics powers a relative power princes. So, if you have any comments, questions, please put them there. It's been a long video. I know. The other video for this before this was 2 hours. Oh my God, how is anyone going to watch that? You should maybe cut these videos up. It's hard. I was trying to keep a chapter, again, a book, a video. Okay. Some people say, maybe you should make this chapter. It's hard to do this because the chapters are not, the chapters are uneven and you can't do such things like this. It's not so simple. So therefore, okay, I submit this everywhere. This may be long. If you liked it, like it. Please like it. Share it on social media. Send it to a friend. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe. Get your friends to subscribe. If you didn't like it, of course, you can always thumb down it, but say why in the comments. Maybe we can learn. Maybe, oh, it's too long. It's too long. Yeah. You can download them. I download a video. You can do that. Another thing you can do if you have not, if you want to, is follow me on social media. The links are below. And if you want to help me do what I'm doing here, the way you can do this is through direct contributions and through Patreon or Subscribestar. That's one way you can do this. You can send me money too, but I don't think it's gonna be easy. Another way you can do it is buy buy one of my books below, or buy it for a gift or a friend or something like that. There's up there for that below. Okay, that's it. That's it. These are done Mondays and Wednesdays. We have one more book. Next time we see each other, we'll look at book 23, which is the last of part 4 about commerce. We then on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, we normally do these contemporary political thinking things and political thought things. And Fridays are usually something either messing around or something outside the normal activities in that sense. Well, that's it. Well, take care and have a good day. Bye bye.